The first time my neighbor told me he had a right to use my driveway, I honestly thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't joking at all. He was serious enough to take me to court over it. And the strangest part? He was claiming a right that was older than the driveway itself, which was impossible because the driveway had only existed for a few years. My name is Daniel Harper, and this started as one of those small neighborhood annoyances you think you can solve with a simple conversation, but somehow turned into a legal battle that taught me a lesson about property, boundaries, and how far some people will go when they believe they can take advantage of someone being reasonable. When I first moved into my house outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, I wasn't looking for problems. I had spent years saving for that place, fixing it up little by little, and turning it into somewhere that actually felt like home. It wasn't some giant mansion or anything like that. It was a modest two-story house with an old maple tree in the front yard, a backyard where I grew vegetables, and a driveway I had personally paid to install after years of dealing with mud and gravel every time it rained. Before that driveway existed, that part of the property was just grass. Nothing special, nothing convenient, just a patch of lawn that got messy whenever the weather turned bad. My neighbor across the street, Marcus Bell, had lived there longer than I had. At first, he seemed like a friendly guy. He was the kind of person who waved from his porch and made small talk whenever he saw you outside. I actually liked him in the beginning. He had stories about the neighborhood going back decades, and I respected that. Older residents often know things about a place that you can't find in paperwork. They know who planted what tree, who built which fence, and how the street changed over time. So when Marcus started using my driveway to turn his truck around, I didn't think much of it. The first few times, it happened maybe once every couple of weeks. He would pull in, back up, turn around, and leave. It took less than 30 seconds. I remember seeing him do it one afternoon while I was carrying groceries inside, and I just shrugged. I thought, he's my neighbor. It's not a big deal. That's the thing about being a decent person. Sometimes you allow small things because you assume the other person understands the difference between kindness and permission. But slowly, that small favor became a routine. A few weeks later, Marcus was doing it almost every day. Then his brother started doing it. Then his daughter. Then delivery drivers who were coming to his house started copying the same pattern because apparently my driveway had somehow become the neighborhood shortcut. I started noticing tire marks cutting into the edge of my lawn. Early in the morning, I would hear engines outside my bedroom window. At night, headlights would sweep across my living room wall as cars pulled in, turned around, and drove away. It was a strange feeling, looking out at your own property and realizing someone else was treating it like public space. One afternoon, I finally walked outside when Marcus was backing his truck out. I wasn't angry. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to have a normal conversation. I walked over and said, "Hey Marcus, can I ask you something? Could you stop using my driveway to turn around? It's private property, and lately it's been happening pretty often." He looked at me for a second, then laughed. Not a friendly laugh either. It was the kind of laugh someone gives when they think the other person is being ridiculous. He leaned against his truck and said, "Daniel, come on. It's just a few feet of concrete. Don't act like I'm building a highway through your yard." I tried to explain that it wasn't about the distance. It was about the fact that I owned it. I said, "I understand it's not a huge thing, but it's still my property. I just need you to respect that." He shook his head and smiled. "Everyone does it." I looked around the street and said, "No, Marcus, everyone doesn't. You do." That was the first moment I noticed something change in his expression. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like he was surprised that I actually pushed back, like he had gotten used to nobody challenging him. I thought the conversation would end there, but apparently Marcus didn't see it that way. 2 days later, I put up a small sign near the driveway. Nothing aggressive, nothing insulting. It simply said, "Private driveway, no turnaround." I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I wasn't trying to start a neighborhood war. I just wanted a clear boundary. And for the next 2 weeks, everything was quiet. No trucks, no random cars, no headlights flashing through my windows. I honestly thought the problem was over. I was wrong. One Tuesday afternoon, I heard a knock on my door. Standing there was a man wearing a gray suit holding a large envelope. He introduced himself as an attorney and handed me the paperwork. I remember looking down at the first page and feeling my stomach drop. Marcus Bell was suing me. The claim said I was interfering with his access rights and unlawfully blocking a route he had supposedly used for years. But then I saw the phrase that made me stop reading for a moment. Historic right of use. Marcus wasn't saying he had permission. He wasn't saying we had an agreement. He was claiming that because he had used my driveway for so long, he somehow had a legal right to continue using it. He wanted the sign removed. He wanted access restored. And he even wanted compensation for what he called the inconvenience I had caused him. I stood there in my kitchen holding those papers, looking out at the driveway I had built with my own money, thinking one thing: how did we get from "please stop using my property" to "I am being sued because I asked for basic respect"? But what Marcus didn't know was that his entire argument depended on one thing: a story about the past. And luckily for me, the past had records. The kind of records that don't care about someone's confidence, reputation, or how loudly they tell their version of events. They just show the truth. And that was when I decided I wasn't going to argue with Marcus anymore. I was going to let the evidence speak. When I first sat down with my attorney, Laura Whitman, I expected her to tell me this was going to be a complicated fight. I expected months of paperwork, expensive hearings, maybe a long argument over what happened and who remembered things correctly. But after she read Marcus's claim carefully, she looked up at me and asked a question I wasn't expecting. "Daniel, how old is your driveway?" I told her it was about 4 years old. She leaned back in her chair and said, "Then we need to start there." At first, I didn't understand why that mattered so much. I thought the entire case was about whether Marcus had been using it or not. But Laura explained something that completely changed the way I looked at the situation. She said, "Someone cannot create a legal right just by telling a story long enough. The question isn't just whether he used it. The question is whether the thing he claims to have used even existed in the way he describes." That sentence stayed with me, because suddenly, I realized Marcus wasn't just exaggerating. He was building an entire argument around a version of history that might not even be real. So we started digging. Laura requested old property records, city documents, and aerial photographs from the county archive. It felt strange going through decades of images of my own property from above. There was something almost surreal about looking at my house before I ever owned it, seeing the land change year by year, like watching a time-lapse video of someone else's life. But then we found exactly what Laura was looking for. The older photographs showed the same thing over and over again. Grass, just grass, no concrete, no gravel, no driveway, no path that connected my property to anything Marcus could claim he had been using for years. The driveway he was fighting over simply wasn't there. I remember staring at those images on my laptop late one night, almost laughing because the whole thing was so unbelievable. Marcus had told everyone he had been using my driveway for over a decade, but the driveway itself was only 4 years old. It was like someone claiming they had been visiting a restaurant for 20 years when the building had only been constructed last summer. The math didn't work. The story didn't work. And suddenly, his confidence started making sense. He wasn't relying on facts. He was relying on the assumption that nobody would check. That bothered me more than the lawsuit itself, because there was something about watching someone try to turn your patience into weakness that really changes how you see them. I started thinking back to every conversation we had, every time I had ignored the tire marks, every time I told myself it wasn't worth making a big deal about. I had mistaken his confidence for certainty. I had mistaken his friendliness for respect. The next step was checking the deed. Laura told me that aerial photos showed the physical reality, but the property records would show the legal reality. When we received the documents, the answer was even clearer. The deed specifically identified the driveway as private property. There was no shared easement, no recorded access agreement, no legal pathway allowing Marcus, his family, or anyone else to use it. Nothing. Just my property, my driveway, my responsibility, my right to decide who used it. At that point, Laura smiled and said, "Daniel, I think your neighbor made one mistake. He assumed nobody would challenge him, and she was right. Marcus had spent years acting like my driveway belonged to everyone because nobody stopped him. But the moment I put up a sign, he didn't see a boundary. He saw a challenge, and instead of simply accepting that the situation had changed, he decided to escalate. As the court date got closer, I started hearing more opinions from people in the neighborhood. Some supported me. Others told me I should have just let it go. One neighbor actually said, "It's only a driveway. Is this really worth fighting over?" And honestly, I understood why they thought that. From the outside, it probably looked petty. Two neighbors arguing over a few feet of concrete. But what people didn't see was the bigger issue. It wasn't about a few feet. It was about whether someone could slowly take control of something just because everyone was too uncomfortable to say no. If someone walked into your house every day and sat in your couch because they had been doing it for years, would time alone make it their couch? Of course not. So, why should property boundaries work differently? The morning of the hearing, I was nervous. I won't pretend I wasn't. Even when you know you're right, sitting in a courtroom changes everything. There is something intimidating about watching a judge walk in, hearing your name called, and realizing that strangers are about to decide something that affects your home. Marcus arrived looking completely different from the man who laughed at me in the driveway months earlier. He wore an expensive suit, carried a folder full of papers, and walked into the courtroom like he was about to collect a victory he had already earned. He sat beside his attorney with this calm confidence that almost made me question myself for a second. Almost. Then I remembered those aerial photos. I remembered the empty grass where my driveway didn't exist. I remembered the deed. And I reminded myself that facts don't get nervous. Facts don't get intimidated. They just sit there and wait. When the judge called the case, Marcus's attorney started explaining their argument. They described the driveway as a route Marcus had used for many years. They talked about history, routine, and neighborhood expectations. They painted a picture of a man who had relied on something for so long that taking it away was unfair. Listening to it, I understood why stories can be powerful. Because if you only heard his side, you might actually believe he was the victim. But then Laura stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack Marcus personally. She simply said, "Your Honor, before we discuss whether someone can claim a historic right to use this property, we need to establish whether this driveway existed during the period he claims." The room got quiet. Marcus's attorney looked confused for a moment. Then Laura connected her laptop to the courtroom display. The first image appeared. The judge looked at the screen. Grass. The second image appeared. More grass. The third image showed construction beginning. Then the final image appeared. My driveway. Brand new. Exactly as it was today. And in that moment, I saw something change. Not dramatically. Not like in a movie where someone jumps up and admits they were wrong. It was much quieter than that. Marcus stopped leaning back. His attorney stopped taking notes. The confidence on his face started fading because the one thing his entire case depended on was disappearing right in front of him. The judge looked at the timeline carefully, then turned toward Marcus and asked the question that changed everything. "Mr. Bell, how long have you been using this driveway?" Marcus answered confidently. "At least 10 years, Your Honor." And that was the moment the entire courtroom understood the problem, because the evidence on the screen told a different story. A story that couldn't be argued with, couldn't be exaggerated, and couldn't be changed by confidence. The judge looked back at the photographs, and everyone in that room knew the same thing. Marcus hadn't just made a weak argument. He had built his entire claim on something that never existed. The courtroom went completely quiet for a few seconds after the judge finished looking through the timeline. It was one of those moments where nobody needed to say anything because the evidence had already said everything. The entire argument Marcus had built around years of use, neighborhood tradition, and this so-called historic right suddenly had a very simple problem. The driveway he claimed to have used for over a decade had only existed for 4 years. The judge looked at Marcus and calmly said, "Mr. Bell, you cannot claim a historic right to something that was not there during the time period you are describing." There was no anger in his voice, no dramatic speech, just a simple statement of fact. And somehow, that made it hit even harder. Marcus sat there silently. And for the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't look like the person in control anymore. He looked like someone who had just realized he had pushed too far. The judge dismissed the claim and warned Marcus about making property claims without proper evidence. The court also ordered him to cover my legal expenses, which honestly felt like the part that bothered him the most. Losing the argument was one thing, but being forced to admit through action that he had been wrong was something completely different. After the hearing, Marcus walked past me in the hallway. I expected him to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, maybe even another argument. But he just looked away and kept walking, and strangely enough, I wasn't angry anymore. I had spent weeks thinking about how frustrating the situation was, how unfair it felt, how someone could take something simple and turn it into a battle. But standing there after it was over, I realized the thing that bothered me most wasn't the driveway. It was the assumption behind everything. Marcus believed that because something had been allowed for a while, it had become his. He believed silence meant permission. He believed patience meant weakness. And maybe that is the part of this story that stuck with me the most. Because a lot of conflicts don't begin with someone trying to take everything from you. They begin with someone taking a little bit, then a little more, until one day you look around and realize the boundary disappeared while you weren't paying attention. The strange thing was, after the court decision, the neighborhood didn't suddenly turn into some perfect place where everyone became friends. Some people still thought I should have handled it differently. A few neighbors told me, you know, Marcus probably just felt like he belonged there because he had been doing it for so long. And I understood that perspective. I really did. I don't think Marcus woke up one morning planning to become my enemy. I think somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that familiarity was the same thing as ownership. He had used that driveway so many times that in his mind, it stopped feeling like someone else's property. But feelings don't replace documents. Memories don't replace records. And confidence doesn't replace the truth. A few days after the ruling, I was sitting on my front porch drinking coffee when I saw Marcus drive down the street. For a moment, I wondered if he would stop. Maybe I expected another confrontation. Maybe I expected him to test the boundary one more time. His truck slowed down near the end of my driveway. He looked toward it. I could see him thinking. Then he turned the wheel and drove past. He took the longer route around the block instead. And honestly, that small moment meant more to me than winning the case, because it showed that the boundary was finally understood. Not because I yelled louder, not because I embarrassed him, not because I tried to get revenge. It was understood because the truth was clear. Since then, I have tried to look at the whole situation differently. I still believe neighbors should help each other. I still believe communities work because people are willing to be flexible and kind. But kindness only works when both sides respect it. The moment someone starts confusing your generosity with their entitlement, things change. I didn't put up a sign because I hated my neighbor. I put up a sign because I wanted my property to remain my property. And sometimes, protecting something doesn't mean you are being difficult. Sometimes it just means you are finally saying, this matters to me. Looking back, the whole experience taught me something I probably should have known earlier. You don't need to fight every battle, but you do need to recognize when someone else has decided to fight one against you. I never wanted a courtroom. I never wanted tension with a neighbor. I just wanted a little respect for the place I worked hard to build. And in the end, that's exactly what I got. Now I want to hear what you think. Was Marcus simply a neighbor who misunderstood the situation? Or did he cross a line by trying to claim something that was never his? Do you think Daniel handled it the right way by taking the legal route? Or should he have tried harder to settle things privately? Leave your thoughts in the comments because these neighborhood disputes always seem simple from the outside, until you are the person standing on your own property wondering where the line disappeared. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more real lifestyle justice stories, and share this with someone who believes boundaries matter, because sometimes the smallest piece of land can reveal the biggest lessons about respect, fairness, and knowing when to stand your ground.